Margaret did not reach for the envelope immediately. Instead, she lifted her water glass, took a measured sip, and set it back down with quiet precision, buying herself seconds to think. Daniel leaned forward as if eager to move the evening along. Olivia rested her manicured fingers lightly on the edge of the manila folder, her expression composed, almost sympathetic. The chandelier light reflected against the polished surface of the table, and Margaret could see her own reflection faintly beneath their hands, smaller than she remembered. "It is a beautiful place," Olivia continued gently. "Private apartment, on-site medical care, social activities, everything handled for you. No more worries about maintenance or managing investments." Margaret folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. She had not taken a single bite. "I have managed my own investments for 40 years, she said evenly. "They have not worried me yet." Daniel exhaled softly, the way he used to when preparing to deliver difficult news to a client. "Mom, this is not about what you can do. It is about what makes sense long-term." He slid the envelope closer to her. The fountain pen followed, its weight deliberate against the paper. Margaret did not touch either object. Instead, she listened. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking. 8 minutes had passed since the note was slipped into her hand. She glanced toward the kitchen doorway. The maid, Hannah, stood partially hidden behind the archway, her face pale, eyes wide with a quiet plea. Margaret turned her attention back to her son. "Why tonight?" she asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. "Just a fraction. Because the attorney is finalizing paperwork tomorrow morning. We thought it would be easier if everything was signed." Olivia nodded. "It protects everyone. It simplifies things. Protects everyone. Simplifies things." The phrases sounded rehearsed, polished to remove any sharp edges. Margaret rested her hands in her lap. She thought of the trust Thomas had set up years before his death, the careful language he insisted upon, the clause that required her direct consent for any transfer of authority. She thought of the recent call she had received from her bank confirming unusual inquiries about her accounts. She had not mentioned them. She had simply listened. 6 minutes. Daniel pushed the envelope closer again. "It is just a formality, Mom. A limited power of attorney, so we can help you with the house and the portfolio." Limited. Margaret finally placed her fingertips on the envelope, but did not open it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. "Help me," she repeated quietly. Across the room, the heating system clicked on, filling the silence with a low hum. Olivia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret could see it now, the faint impatience beneath the politeness. 5 minutes. She imagined the life they had already arranged for her without asking. The sale of her townhouse. The transfer of accounts. The polite announcement to friends that it was time for her to step aside. She lifted her eyes and met Daniel's gaze fully. "You should have told me the truth," she said, her voice steady, almost gentle. His expression flickered, confusion mixing with something closer to fear. For minutes, Margaret slipped her hand into her purse and felt the folded note again. "Run now." She did not stand. Not yet. She was not finished listening. Margaret let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, the kind that made people reveal more than they intended. Daniel shifted in his chair and loosened his grip on the fountain pen. Olivia cleared her throat softly, then reached across the table and opened the envelope herself as if to keep the momentum from slipping away. She removed a neatly stacked set of documents and spread them with careful alignment, each page marked with small yellow tabs indicating where a signature was required. Margaret glanced down but did not lean closer. 3 minutes. "It is standard," Olivia said gently. "A transfer of financial authority for efficiency. Temporary, of course." Margaret read the heading without touching the paper. Durable power of attorney. The word durable lingered in her mind longer than the others. She noticed the clause halfway down the first page that granted full discretion over real estate decisions. That was not temporary. That was permanent unless revoked. Daniel spoke quickly now, as if speed might carry them past scrutiny. "Mom, you always said you trusted me. This just makes everything easier in case something happens." Margaret looked up slowly. "Something like what?" she asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Health issues. Accidents. Cognitive decline. We are planning ahead." 2 minutes. Margaret thought of the annual physical she had completed just last month, the clean bill of health, the long walks she took every morning around the lake near her townhouse. She thought of the way Daniel had asked subtle questions recently about her passwords, her property taxes, the appraisal on her home. She had answered politely, but never fully. She saw it clearly now. The dinner was not about care. It was about consolidation. Olivia slid the pen closer to Margaret's hand. "We only want to protect you," she said. The phrase sounded softer than it felt. Margaret rested her palms flat on the table and felt the cool wood beneath her skin. 1 minute. She imagined signing. She imagined the phone calls that would follow. The listing of her home. The polite announcement that she had chosen to move into a managed community. The narrative would be clean, responsible, sensible. She looked toward the hallway again. Hannah was gone from the doorway, but the kitchen light remained on, casting a narrow glow across the floor. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her reading glasses. She placed them carefully on her nose and began turning each page slowly, deliberately, her movements calm and unhurried. The ticking clock seemed louder now, almost impatient. "There is an error," she said finally, her voice steady. Daniel stiffened. "What error?" Margaret removed her glasses and folded them. "You cannot transfer authority over assets that are no longer solely in my name." Daniel's expression faltered. Olivia blinked, caught off balance. "What do you mean?" Margaret met her son's eyes without anger, without accusation. "It means," she said quietly, "that this conversation is 10 years too late." Daniel stared at her as if he had misheard. 10 years too late? He repeated, the certainty in his voice thinning. Margaret folded her glasses and placed them beside her untouched plate. The salmon had grown cold, the glaze dull under the chandelier light. She did not rush her words. She did not raise her voice. "After your father passed," she said evenly, "I met with our attorney and a financial advisor. I restructured everything." Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the document stack. "Restructured how?" she asked, her tone still composed but less steady than before. Margaret looked from one to the other, not accusing, not defensive, simply factual. The house, the investment accounts, the long-term portfolio. They were placed into an irrevocable trust. My name remains as primary beneficiary during my lifetime. Control is assigned to an independent trustee. Daniel blinked. "You never told me that." Margaret gave a small nod. "You never asked." The clock continued its patient ticking. Outside, a car passed along the quiet suburban street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the dining room curtains. Margaret remembered the afternoon she signed those papers, sitting in a modest office with dark leather chairs and a framed certificate from Georgetown law hanging on the wall. She had not acted out of suspicion back then. She had acted out of responsibility. Thomas had always believed in preparation. "Do not leave loose ends," he used to say. She had followed that advice. Olivia leaned back in her chair. "So you are saying this document does nothing?" Margaret shook her head gently. "It does something. It reveals assumptions." Daniel's jaw tightened again. "Mom, this was not about taking anything from you." Margaret studied his face carefully, the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened over the years, the familiar crease between his brows that appeared when he felt cornered. "Then why was it urgent?" she asked quietly. "Why was the attorney ready tomorrow morning?" Silence answered first. Then Daniel spoke more softly. "We thought you might resist if we waited." The honesty slipped out before he could retrieve it. Olivia's posture stiffened. Margaret felt something settle inside her, not anger, not shock, but clarity. She had sensed the shift for months. The subtle distance. The financial questions framed as casual curiosity. The repeated suggestions that she deserved a simpler life. She had listened. She had adjusted. "I am not incapable," she said calmly. "And I am not unaware." Daniel rubbed his temple, the confident host replaced by a son who had miscalculated. "We were trying to plan ahead." Margaret rose slowly from her chair. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. She gathered her purse and slipped the folded note securely inside. "Planning ahead," she said, looking at both of them in turn, "is something I have always done." The room felt different now, less like a stage and more like a reckoning. The envelope lay open on the table, its pages suddenly meaningless. Margaret reached for her coat draped over the back of the chair. She did not slam it down. She did not accuse. She simply prepared to leave. "You built this evening on the assumption that I was unprepared," she said quietly. "That was your mistake." Daniel stood, halfway as if unsure whether to stop her. Olivia remained seated, calculating. Margaret walked toward the hallway, passing the kitchen where Hannah stood near the sink, eyes wide with relief. Margaret offered her a small, steady nod. She stepped into the cool night air, the porch light casting a soft circle on the driveway. Behind her, through the large front window, she could see the dining room table still set for a celebration that had never truly existed. Margaret walked down the stone path toward her car without looking back, the cool night air steady against her face, clearing the last traces of warmth from the dining room she had just left behind. The porch light cast long shadows across the driveway, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to stand still beside the driver's door, listening to the quiet hum of the suburban street. She did not feel shaken. She felt alert. Inside the house, silhouettes moved behind the curtains, shapes pacing where certainty had once been. She unlocked her car and sat behind the wheel, placing her purse carefully on the passenger seat. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, calm and deliberate. She reached into her purse and unfolded the small note again. Run now. The ink had bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. It had not been written as drama. It had been written as warning. Margaret started the engine but did not pull away immediately. Instead, she took out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The call was answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Margaret," the familiar voice said. It was Harold Benton, the independent trustee Thomas had insisted upon years ago. "I believe we need to accelerate our timeline," she said evenly. There was no tremor in her voice. Harold did not ask unnecessary questions. "Understood," he replied. "I will initiate the protective provisions tomorrow morning." Margaret nodded, even though he could not see her. "Please ensure that all communications regarding the trust are directed exclusively through your office from this point forward." "Consider it done," he said. She ended the call and finally backed out of the driveway. As she drove the 40 minutes back toward her townhouse, the rhythm of the road beneath her tires steadied her thoughts. She replayed Daniel's expression when he realized the documents were useless. Not anger, not regret, surprise. He had believed preparation was on his side. He had believed urgency would pressure her into compliance. What he had not considered was that she had been preparing quietly for years. She turned onto her street and parked in her usual spot beneath the maple tree that had shed its leaves early that fall. Inside her home, everything remained exactly as she had left it that afternoon. The hallway lamp cast a soft amber glow. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the diffuser she kept near the entryway. Margaret removed her coat and hung it carefully. She did not rush. She did not pace. She moved through her living room, past the framed photographs of Thomas and Daniel at various stages of life, and paused briefly before the oldest one. Daniel at age 7, holding a fishing rod twice his height, grinning beside his father at a lake in upstate New York. She studied the photograph without bitterness. Then she turned away. She walked to her desk and opened the top drawer, retrieving a slim leather folder. Inside were copies of the trust documents, bank confirmations, and letters from her attorney outlining contingencies she had never expected to use so soon. She placed the folder on the desk and sat down. The evening had not ended in chaos. It had ended in revelation. Margaret switched on the small desk lamp and began reviewing each page again, not because she doubted her decisions, but because she believed in vigilance. Across town, Daniel and Olivia were likely recalculating. But Margaret was no longer reacting. She was advancing. Margaret remained at her desk long after midnight, the quiet of the house settling around her like a steady shield. The desk lamp cast a narrow circle of light over the documents, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. She read each clause carefully, not because she doubted their strength, but because she believed in understanding every layer of protection she had built. Outside, a light wind moved through the maple branches, brushing them gently against the siding. The evening replayed in her mind without distortion. Daniel's urgency, Olivia's polished concern, the carefully positioned pen. It had not been spontaneous. It had been arranged. Margaret closed the leather folder and reached for her phone again. She scrolled through recent messages and found the email confirmation from her bank regarding the account access. Inquiries made 3 weeks earlier. At the time, she had marked the message and said nothing. Now she forwarded it directly to Harold Benton with a brief note requesting an internal review. She did not accuse. She documented. That had always been her approach. She stood and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water and leaning lightly against the counter. The house felt steady, grounded. Nothing here had shifted. Yet everything had clarified. She remembered the gradual change over the past year. The way Daniel had begun asking more frequent questions about her long-term plans. The way Olivia had suggested that managing property taxes and investment statements must be exhausting at her age. The suggestions had sounded thoughtful on the surface. Underneath, they had been exploratory. Margaret returned to her desk and opened her laptop. She logged into her secure account portal and confirmed that multi-factor authentication had been updated to her private device only. She changed 2 passwords, not because they had been compromised, but because vigilance required movement. Her motions were unhurried and precise. She then drafted a short email to her primary care physician requesting a copy of her latest health assessment for her personal records. It would be useful, she knew, to have documented proof of her mental and physical clarity should anyone attempt to question it. She did not assume Daniel would escalate, but she refused to underestimate the disappointment of someone who believed control had been within reach. The digital clock on her desk read 1:17 a.m. Margaret closed the laptop and stood once more, walking slowly through the hallway to the small guest bedroom she had converted into a study years earlier. On the bookshelf rested a framed letter from Thomas written shortly before his passing. In it he had thanked her for being steady when circumstances were not. She touched the frame lightly and allowed herself a quiet breath. She was not reacting out of pride. She was responding out of stewardship. In another part of town, Daniel and Olivia were likely discussing their next step, recalculating, perhaps convincing themselves that they had acted out of concern. Margaret understood something they did not. Control gained through urgency is fragile. Control built over time is durable. She turned off the hallway light and returned to her bedroom, placing the leather folder on the nightstand within reach. She lay down without anxiety. The evening had not weakened her position. It had confirmed it. And tomorrow, she would begin adjusting the perimeter quietly, deliberately, without ever raising her voice. Margaret woke just before sunrise, not from anxiety, but from habit. The house was quiet, wrapped in the pale blue light of early morning. She rose slowly, tied her robe at the waist, and walked into the kitchen where she measured coffee grounds with steady precision. The routine grounded her. Outside the window, a thin layer of frost coated the grass, delicate and temporary. She poured the coffee into her favorite ceramic mug and carried it to the small breakfast table near the window. Her phone rested beside her, screen dark for now. At 7:12 a.m., it vibrated softly. Daniel's name appeared. She let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning," she said, her voice even. There was a pause on the other end. "Mom, we need to talk," Daniel said. The confidence from the previous evening had faded, replaced by careful restraint. "We spoke last night," Margaret replied calmly. "Not completely," he said. She could hear Olivia's faint voice in the background, low and urgent. "There are things you did not tell us." Margaret looked out at the frost melting under the first touch of sunlight. "There are many things I did not need to tell you," she answered. Silence stretched between them. Daniel shifted his tone. "You made it seem like we were trying to trap you." The words slipped out unintentionally. Margaret noticed. "Were you not?" she asked gently. He exhaled slowly. "We were trying to protect our future." Margaret set her mug down without a sound. "Your future is not dependent on controlling mine," she said. "If it is, then you have miscalculated." On the other end, Olivia's voice rose slightly, then softened again as if recalibrating. Daniel spoke once more. "The trustee called this morning," he said carefully. "He informed us that all communication regarding your assets must go through his office. That was unnecessary." Margaret did not respond immediately. The frost outside had almost disappeared now, replaced by clear grass. "It was necessary," she said. "Clarity is always necessary." Another pause. "Are you cutting us out?" Daniel asked. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration but in recognition. "I am adjusting boundaries," she replied. "There is a difference." She ended the call before the conversation could turn circular. She did not block his number. She did not escalate. She simply finished her coffee and stood to begin her day. Later that morning, she drove to the lake as she did most Thursdays, walking the 2-mile path at a steady pace. The air was crisp, her breath visible in short clouds. Other walkers passed her, nodding politely. Her stride remained strong. As she circled the final bend, She understood something with complete certainty. Daniel and Olivia would attempt to reinterpret last night as misunderstanding. They would frame it as concern, as planning, as love expressed awkwardly. But intention reveals itself through urgency. And urgency had been present at that table. Margaret completed her walk and returned home, her posture straight, her pace measured. She was not retreating from her son. She was repositioning. The perimeter had shifted, and she had chosen where the new lines would be drawn. By late afternoon, the house felt quieter than usual, not empty, but recalibrated. Margaret sat at her dining table with a legal pad in front of her, the afternoon light stretching across the hardwood floor in long pale lines. She had spent the morning confirming small details, not dramatic ones. The homeowner insurance policy had been updated to list the trust as primary owner. The property tax notifications were redirected exclusively to the trustee's office. The safe deposit box at her bank had been reviewed and inventoried. None of it was reactionary. It was maintenance. Her phone buzzed once more around 3 o'clock. This time it was Olivia. Margaret let the call go to voicemail. A minute later, a message appeared. "We only wanted to help. We did not expect you to shut us out." Margaret read it once, then placed the phone face down on the table. Help did not arrive with pre-printed signature tabs. Help did not require urgency. She stood and walked toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall. Daniel at his high school graduation. Daniel in his first business suit. Daniel at 30, smiling beside Olivia on their wedding day. Margaret studied each image without resentment. She had not raised him to be small. She had raised him to lead. Somewhere along the way, leadership had blended into entitlement. That shift had not happened overnight. It had been gradual, subtle, layered beneath phrases about responsibility and efficiency. She returned to the table and picked up the leather folder once more. Inside was a letter she had drafted months earlier but never finalized. It outlined a revised distribution plan within the trust, one that tied future inheritance to demonstrable respect for her autonomy. It was not punitive. It was conditional. She read the paragraph slowly, adjusting a sentence here, clarifying a clause there. She added one new line. "Any attempt to undermine my legal capacity will result in immediate reevaluation of beneficiary status." The wording was calm, direct, unemotional. She signed the bottom with steady ink. As evening approached, the light outside softened into amber. Margaret prepared a simple dinner for herself, grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, setting a single place at the table. She ate without distraction. No raised voices echoed in her home. No documents waited beside her plate. Afterward, she washed the dishes and dried them carefully, the routine grounding her again. At 7:45, Daniel called once more. She answered this time. "Mom, can we come by tomorrow?" he asked. His voice carried fatigue now, less authority. Margaret considered the request. "You may come by," she said, "but there will be no paperwork. Only conversation." A pause. "All right," he replied quietly. After the call ended, Margaret stepped onto her back porch. The evening air was cool but steady, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. She looked out over her small yard, the fence line clearly defined against the darkening sky. Boundaries, she thought, were not walls built in anger. They were lines drawn in clarity. Inside the house, the lights glowed warm and constant. Margaret turned and went back in, closing the door gently behind her. The next afternoon arrived without tension, only quiet expectation. Margaret set 2 cups on the coffee table in her living room and adjusted the blinds to let in natural light. She did not arrange documents on display. She did not stage a defense. When the doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, she walked to the front door at an unhurried pace and opened it. Daniel stood on the porch, shoulders slightly rounded, his confidence tempered. Olivia stood beside him, composed but less certain than before. Margaret stepped aside to let them in. No one embraced. No one argued. They moved into the living room and sat across from her, the distance between the chairs deliberate but not hostile. For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the hallway clock filled the silence. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "We handled this badly," he said. The admission sounded unfamiliar on his tongue. Margaret did not nod in triumph. She simply listened. Olivia folded her hands together. "We thought we were being practical," she added. "We did not realize how it would look." Margaret rested her hands lightly on her knees. "It looked like urgency," she replied. And urgency, without discussion, feels like removal. Daniel exhaled slowly. We were thinking about expansion, he admitted. A second property. Investment leverage. It would have been easier if assets were consolidated. Margaret held his gaze. Easier for whom? She asked gently. The question lingered. Olivia glanced down. Daniel did not answer immediately. The truth did not need embellishment. Margaret leaned back slightly. I am not opposed to growth, she said. But growth that depends on my silence is not partnership. It is pressure. The words were calm, not cutting. Daniel's posture shifted again, less defensive now. We did not see it that way, he said quietly. Margaret rose and walked toward the hallway, returning with the leather folder in her hands. She did not open it. She placed it on the table between them. This is not a threat, she said. It is structure. The trust remains. The boundaries remain. What changes is transparency. Olivia looked up. What does that mean? Margaret answered without hesitation. It means if you have ideas, you bring them to me without documents prepared in advance. It means my autonomy is not a variable in your calculations. It means respect is not implied. It is demonstrated. The room felt steadier after that. No one raised their voice. No one reached for paperwork. Daniel nodded slowly. We understand, he said, though understanding would require time to prove. Margaret stood and walked them to the door when the conversation concluded. There were no dramatic farewells, only measured acknowledgement. After the door closed, she returned to her living room and sat once more in her chair. The house felt balanced again, not because control had been asserted loudly, but because it had been clarified. She picked up her tea and looked toward the window where afternoon light filtered softly across the floor. 10 minutes at a dinner table had revealed more than months of polite conversation. They had believed they were building leverage. Instead, they had revealed intent. And Margaret, steady as ever, had not run. She had repositioned.